The people who look the weakest are often carrying the strongest stories. The only question is whether anyone is patient enough to discover them. The first cool breeze of October drifted along Maple Avenue as the morning sun painted soft, golden light across the windows of Harper's Café. Inside, the familiar rhythm of the neighborhood had already begun. Coffee beans crackled inside polished machines. Ceramic mugs touched wooden tables with gentle clicks. Quiet conversations floated through the warm air while fresh cinnamon pastries filled the room with comforting sweetness. It looked like an ordinary Friday. Nothing about the morning hinted that dozens of strangers were only minutes away from witnessing a moment none of them would ever forget. Ethan Carter pushed open the cafe door with one hand while holding it for his 8-year-old daughter, Emma. She skipped inside first, clutching her small backpack against her pink sweater. Ethan followed behind wearing faded blue jeans, worn work boots, and a weathered denim jacket that had clearly survived years of hard work. The jacket looked old enough to attract judgment from people who believed appearances told the whole story. Ethan never seemed to mind. "Daddy," Emma asked with an excited smile, "do we still get one hot chocolate and one chocolate muffin?" Ethan smiled as though nothing in the world mattered more than answering that question. "Of course we do. Friday traditions should never be broken." Emma giggled and reached for his hand. They had very little compared with many families, yet every Friday morning belonged entirely to them. One drink. One muffin. Two people quietly celebrating another week they had made it through together. Across the cafe, a woman entered through the opposite door almost unnoticed. Claire Bennett removed her sunglasses before slipping them into the pocket of her cream-colored coat. Beneath it she wore a navy business suit that would have looked perfectly natural inside the headquarters of a Fortune 500 company. Few people inside Harper's Café recognized the woman who had quietly built one of the country's fastest-growing technology companies. That anonymity was exactly why she had chosen this little neighborhood cafe. For one peaceful hour, she wanted to escape board meetings, shareholders, and reporters. She settled into a quiet table near the window, ordered a black coffee, and opened a notebook instead of her laptop. She intended to spend the morning thinking about business. Instead, something else would soon demand her full attention. Ethan helped Emma remove her backpack before gently brushing a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face. "Window seat?" he asked. Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Always." They laughed together while choosing a small wooden table near the front of the cafe. Several customers noticed them only briefly before returning to their conversations. Ethan looked like dozens of hardworking fathers who visited the cafe every week. Quiet. Respectful. Easy to overlook. Claire glanced toward them for only a moment before returning to her notebook. Yet something about the father caught her attention. Not his clothes. Not his appearance. His patience. Every movement seemed unhurried. Every word he spoke to Emma carried calm reassurance instead of exhaustion. It was unusual. Especially for someone who looked as though life had asked far more from him than it had given back. Outside, a glossy black luxury sedan eased into a parking space. Seconds later, a sharply dressed man stepped onto the sidewalk with the confidence of someone convinced every room belonged to him before he entered it. Derek Collins adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket, checked his expensive watch, and smiled at his own reflection in the cafe window before walking inside. His polished shoes echoed softly against the hardwood floor as several people instinctively glanced toward him. Derek welcomed attention the way other people welcomed sunshine. He scanned the cafe with casual arrogance until his eyes settled on Ethan's faded jacket. His smile widened ever so slightly. Claire noticed the brief expression without understanding why it bothered her. Ethan, meanwhile, remained completely focused on Emma as she carefully counted the dollars she had saved for their weekly breakfast. Neither father nor daughter realized that the peaceful morning they treasured every Friday was about to change forever. Derek Collins paused just inside the entrance, taking in the quiet atmosphere as though he were evaluating a room that existed solely for his approval. Conversation softened for a moment before returning to normal. He enjoyed that reaction. Attention, even the briefest glance from strangers, always felt deserved. He ordered an expensive espresso without looking at the menu, then casually turned toward the seating area. His eyes settled once again on Ethan Carter's worn jacket and dusty work boots. The faint smile on Derek's face sharpened. "Well," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "I guess not everyone got the memo that decent restaurants have dress codes." A few customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others lowered their eyes into their coffee, pretending not to notice. Emma looked up at her father, confusion replacing the cheerful smile she had worn only moments earlier. Ethan simply continued placing a napkin beside her plate before quietly thanking the waitress as she delivered their hot chocolate and muffin. Derek laughed softly. "Did you hear me?" Ethan finally looked toward him with calm blue eyes. "I did." "Then maybe you should answer." Ethan offered a polite smile instead of irritation. "I do not think every comment deserves an answer." Derek chuckled louder, encouraged by the silence around him. "That explains the clothes. You have probably spent your entire life letting people walk all over you." Emma tightened her grip around the warm ceramic cup. She had seen adults disagree before, but there was something different about the man's voice. It carried the confidence of someone who believed kindness was weakness. Ethan noticed his daughter's expression immediately. Instead of looking back at Derek, he leaned slightly toward Emma. "Careful, sweetheart. The cup is hot." Emma nodded quietly. "Are we leaving?" she whispered. Ethan shook his head with a gentle smile. "No. We came here for breakfast together. No one should lose a peaceful morning because someone else forgot how to be respectful." His words were soft, yet several nearby customers heard every syllable. "Claire." Bennett slowly lifted her eyes from her notebook. Until now, she had deliberately stayed out of the situation, believing it would resolve itself. Instead, she found herself studying Ethan more carefully than before. Most people under public pressure either defended themselves immediately or allowed anger to speak first. Ethan had done neither. His first concern had been his daughter. Claire quietly closed her notebook. Derek stepped closer to Ethan's table, clearly disappointed that his remarks had failed to provoke the reaction he wanted. "You know what amazes me?" Derek said. "People like you always pretend dignity is enough. But dignity does not pay bills. It does not buy success. It certainly does not earn respect." Ethan folded his hands on the table. "Real respect cannot be purchased." Derek rolled his eyes dramatically. "That sounds exactly like something a broke man would say." A nervous laugh escaped one customer before quickly fading. The waitress behind the counter looked toward the manager, uncertain whether someone should intervene. Even the familiar hiss of the espresso machine seemed quieter than before. Claire watched Derek with growing disappointment. Wealth had introduced her to many successful people over the years, but she had learned that confidence and character rarely arrived together by accident. Derek displayed one without the other. Emma looked down at the untouched muffin in front of her. The excitement she had carried into the cafe had completely disappeared. Ethan noticed immediately. He slid the plate slightly closer to her and smiled. "Remember what we talked about?" Emma looked up. "About what?" "We never allow another person's bad manners to decide whether we enjoy our blessings." Slowly, Emma managed a small smile and broke off a piece of the muffin. Claire felt something shift inside her as she watched the exchange. There was an unusual steadiness in Ethan that refused to bend under humiliation. It was not pride. It was not stubbornness. It was quiet strength. Derek mistook that silence for surrender. The people inside Harper's Café mistook it for weakness. Claire, however, was beginning to suspect they were all witnessing something entirely different. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The silence hanging over Harper's Café felt heavier than Derek Collins's mocking words. Customers glanced between the sharply dressed businessman and the father seated quietly with his daughter, uncertain whether the confrontation had ended or was only beginning. Derek interpreted the silence as victory. Ethan treated it as peace worth protecting. He picked up his coffee, thanked the waitress once more, and took a slow sip as though the room around him had not changed at all. That composure irritated Derek far more than any angry reply could have. "You really do not understand, do you?" Derek said with a dismissive laugh. "People remember confidence. They remember success. Nobody remembers ordinary men." Ethan looked at him for a brief moment before answering. "Sometimes the people who make the greatest difference are the ones no one notices until they are gone." Derek smirked. "That sounds like another excuse." Ethan simply nodded. "Maybe." Claire Bennett continued observing without saying a word. She had spent years negotiating billion-dollar contracts, interviewing executives, and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Experience had taught her that character often revealed itself during moments of discomfort rather than moments of success. Derek filled every silence with his own voice. Ethan filled every silence with patience. The contrast fascinated her. Emma quietly finished another bite of her muffin before whispering, "Daddy, why is he angry?" Ethan smiled gently enough that only she could see it. "Sometimes people carry burdens that have nothing to do with us. We should never assume we are the reason." Emma thought about that answer for a moment before nodding. Claire noticed the exchange and found herself lowering her notebook completely. Ethan was not merely protecting his daughter from embarrassment. He was protecting her from bitterness. That required remarkable discipline. At a nearby table, an elderly gentleman who visited the café almost every morning folded his newspaper and studied Ethan with quiet curiosity. Something about the father's voice seemed strangely familiar, though he could not place it. Across the room, one of the baristas looked twice at Ethan before returning to the espresso machine. There was the faintest expression of recognition on her face, but it disappeared before anyone else noticed. Derek remained completely unaware. He took another step toward Ethan's table. "Tell me something," he said. "What do you actually do for a living?" Ethan answered honestly. "I work with my hands." Derek laughed. "That explains everything." Several people forced polite smiles, but the laughter never spread. Instead, an uncomfortable silence settled once again. Ethan continued, "There is honor in honest work." "Only if it pays well," Derek replied. Ethan looked toward Emma before speaking again. "The paycheck feeds my family. The work shapes my character. Both matter." Claire slowly crossed her arms. Those words lingered in her mind longer than she expected. They reminded her of conversations she had once shared with someone many years earlier, someone who believed leadership began with humility rather than authority. She could not explain why Ethan's calm voice awakened that distant memory. Outside the cafe window, rain clouds began drifting across the bright autumn sky, softening the sunlight that had filled the room earlier. The atmosphere inside felt equally transformed. Customers who had entered expecting an ordinary breakfast now watched every exchange with growing attention. Derek believed he was exposing weakness. Claire increasingly believed she was witnessing uncommon strength. Then another small detail caught her attention. As Ethan reached into his worn leather wallet to pay for breakfast before leaving, a simple metal keychain slipped onto the table. It landed beside his coffee with a quiet click. It was old, scratched from years of use, and attached to an engraved silver medallion bearing a distinctive emblem. Claire's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She had seen that symbol before. Not recently. Not often. But enough to know it was connected to someone whose reputation had earned respect in rooms where titles alone meant very little. Ethan casually picked it up without noticing her reaction, and slipped it back into his pocket. Claire said nothing. Yet for the first time since entering Harper's Cafe, she was no longer merely observing a stranger. She was beginning to wonder if the quiet father everyone had underestimated was carrying a story far greater than anyone in the room could possibly imagine. Claire Bennett could not take her eyes off the pocket where Ethan had slipped the weathered keychain. The engraved emblem lingered in her memory like the opening notes of a familiar song she had not heard in years. She knew she had seen it before, not in a magazine or at a public event, but during one of the most challenging moments of her own career. The connection refused to become clear, yet it was strong enough to replace curiosity with certainty. Ethan Carter was not the ordinary man everyone believed him to be. Across the cafe, Derek Collins mistook Claire's thoughtful expression for admiration directed at him. Straightening his tailored jacket, he smiled confidently before addressing the room once more. "You know what the problem is," he announced. "People spend too much time celebrating humility. Success should be obvious. If you have accomplished something in life, people should be able to see it the moment you walk through the door." No one answered. The silence no longer belonged to Derek. It belonged to everyone quietly questioning him. Ethan remained seated beside Emma, carefully helping her wipe a spot of chocolate from the corner of her smile. "There," he said softly. "Much better." Emma giggled. "Thanks, Daddy." That simple exchange drew Claire's attention again. Every movement Ethan made reflected the same quiet consistency. He was patient with strangers, gentle with his daughter, respectful toward the staff. There was no performance in his behavior. It simply seemed to be who he was. Suddenly, the elderly gentleman who had been reading his newspaper slowly stood from his table. Carrying his empty coffee cup toward the counter, he paused beside Ethan. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Have we met before?" Ethan smiled apologetically. "I do not think so, sir." The older man studied Ethan's face for another second before nodding. "Perhaps not. You just remind me of someone I respected a long time ago." Ethan inclined his head respectfully. "That is a compliment I appreciate." The gentleman smiled warmly before walking away. Derek rolled his eyes. "Amazing. Now people are inventing mysterious stories about you." Ethan answered without irritation. "Everyone carries a story. Most simply choose not to tell it." Claire heard that sentence clearly. She wrote it down in the corner of her notebook almost without thinking. A few feet away, one of the younger baristas whispered to the cafe manager, "I think I know who he is." The manager frowned. "Who?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "Maybe I am mistaken." Claire noticed the exchange but could not hear the words. Even so, she recognized the expression immediately. It was the look of someone trying to connect scattered memories into a complete picture. The pieces were beginning to move. Derek, however, remained oblivious. He reached into his wallet, removed several crisp $100 bills, and dropped them dramatically onto the counter. "Everyone's breakfast is on me," he declared loudly. A few customers looked surprised. Others politely thanked him. Derek smiled, convinced he had reclaimed the room. Ethan quietly stood, walked toward the register, and placed enough cash on the counter to pay only for his own breakfast. "Sir," the waitress said gently, "your meal has already been covered." Ethan smiled kindly. "Then please use this to help the next family that walks in and may need it more than we do." The waitress blinked in surprise. "Are you sure?" "Very sure." Emma looked proudly at her father without saying a word. The waitress accepted the money with both hands, visibly touched. Derek watched the exchange with a puzzled expression. He had paid for attention. Ethan had given without asking for recognition. Somehow, the second gesture carried far greater weight. Claire felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. Truly accomplished people rarely announce themselves. They revealed themselves through ordinary decisions made when no reward was expected. She closed her notebook completely and rose from her chair. She had entered Harper's Café hoping for one quiet hour away from business. Instead, she had found a man whose presence was raising more questions than any boardroom meeting ever had. As she took her first step toward Ethan's table, neither Derek nor anyone else realized that the conversation about to begin would change the direction of the entire morning. Claire Bennett walked toward Ethan's table with measured confidence, unaware that every pair of eyes in Harper's Café had quietly shifted in her direction. She had intended only to satisfy a growing curiosity, yet each step strengthened the feeling that the calm father before her was somehow connected to a chapter of her own past she had nearly forgotten. Ethan noticed her approach and stood immediately, not because he recognized her, but because respect had always been his first instinct. "Good morning," Claire said with a warm smile. "May I ask you a question?" "Of course," Ethan replied. "Please." Emma looked between the two adults with innocent curiosity while quietly sipping the last of her hot chocolate. Claire hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "That emblem on your keychain, where did you get it?" Ethan instinctively touched the pocket where he had placed it. A gentle smile crossed his face, one filled with memory rather than pride. "It belonged to someone who changed my life many years ago." Claire's heartbeat quickened. "Was it given to you?" Ethan nodded. "Yes. It reminds me to remain grateful, especially on difficult days." Derek Collins folded his arms with obvious impatience. "Seriously? We are talking about an old keychain now?" Claire ignored him completely. Her attention never left Ethan. "Would you mind showing it to me?" Without hesitation, Ethan removed the worn keychain and placed it carefully in her hand. Claire studied the engraved silver medallion, her eyes widening as she turned it over. On the back, beneath years of scratches, were 3 small engraved words: "Lead with honor." Claire whispered the phrase almost unconsciously. Ethan smiled. Most people never notice that side. The words struck Claire with unexpected force. Nearly 12 years earlier, before her company had grown beyond a small office with borrowed furniture, an aging business mentor had carried an identical medallion attached to his office keys. He repeated those same 3 words at the end of every difficult meeting. "Lead with honor." After his passing, Claire had believed every one of those handcrafted medallions had disappeared with him. Yet one now rested quietly in her hand. "Where did you meet him?" she asked softly. Ethan answered without hesitation. "I was working construction after leaving the military. One afternoon I repaired part of his workshop after a storm. He offered to pay me. I refused because it only seemed like the right thing to do. Before I left, he handed me this and told me that people would always remember character longer than talent." Claire stared at Ethan in silence. The story matched perfectly. Every detail aligned with memories she had never shared publicly. Derek laughed dismissively. "So your greatest achievement is getting a free keychain?" This time, no one laughed with him. Even the customers who had remained neutral earlier now watched him with visible discomfort. Ethan accepted the keychain back and slipped it into his pocket. "Some gifts cannot be measured by their price." Claire slowly smiled. "No," she said quietly. "They cannot." Before anyone could speak again, an anxious voice suddenly called from the front entrance. "Is anyone here trained in emergency response?" A middle-aged man rushed inside supporting an elderly woman whose face had turned pale. She appeared weak and unsteady, struggling to remain standing as frightened customers immediately moved aside. The cafe manager hurried forward but looked overwhelmed. Several people instinctively reached for their phones while others froze, unsure how to help. Claire's attention shifted toward the entrance. Derek stepped backward, avoiding the growing crowd. Ethan's expression changed instantly. The calm father who had quietly endured humiliation only moments earlier became completely focused. He gently placed one reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "stay right here with Miss Claire for just a minute." Emma nodded without fear. Claire met Ethan's eyes for the briefest moment. There was no hesitation in them. No uncertainty. Only calm purpose. Without another word, Ethan moved quickly toward the distressed woman as the conversations throughout Harper's Café stopped all at once. For the first time that morning, every person in the room forgot about Derek Collins completely. The atmosphere inside Harper's Café transformed in an instant. Moments earlier, every conversation had revolved around pride, appearances, and wounded egos. Now none of those things mattered. Ethan Carter knelt beside the elderly woman with calm efficiency, his voice steady enough to quiet the growing panic around him. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked gently. The woman nodded weakly. "I feel dizzy." Ethan offered a reassuring smile. "You are doing well. Just keep looking at me." He asked the people nearby to give her space while another customer called for medical assistance. His instructions were clear, respectful, and free from panic. No one questioned him. They simply listened. Claire Bennett watched every movement with growing amazement. There was no hesitation in Ethan's actions. Every decision flowed naturally, as though he had practiced remaining calm during difficult moments hundreds of times before. Derek Collins stood several feet away, uncertain what to do. The confidence that had filled his voice only minutes earlier had disappeared completely. He glanced around the room, hoping someone else would take control. They already had. Ethan quietly asked the woman's husband several simple questions while continuing to reassure both of them. "She is breathing well," he said calmly. "Let us keep her comfortable until help arrives." The older man nodded gratefully, his trembling hands slowly becoming steadier under Ethan's reassuring presence. Emma remained beside Claire without complaint. She watched her father with quiet admiration, clearly familiar with the calm confidence he displayed whenever someone needed help. Claire looked down at her. "Has your father done this before?" Emma smiled proudly. "Daddy always says the first job is helping people feel safe." Claire felt a chill run through her. That sentence sounded remarkably familiar. Years ago, during a leadership seminar organized by her late mentor, one guest speaker had repeated nearly the same words after describing service, responsibility, and courage. She had never forgotten them. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. The speaker had been introduced as a decorated former special operations medic who quietly left military service after years of distinguished work and chose a life away from public recognition. Claire slowly looked back toward Ethan. The posture, the discipline, the humility. The pieces finally fit together. Ethan had never claimed to be extraordinary because he had never needed to. Derek finally cleared his throat. "Well, anyone could stay calm in a situation like this." Before Ethan could answer, the cafe manager spoke for the first time. "No, sir." Everyone turned toward him. Most of us froze. "He did not." The room became silent once again. A few moments later, emergency medical professionals arrived. Ethan calmly summarized everything he had observed before stepping aside without seeking acknowledgement. One of the responders listened carefully before extending a grateful hand. "Thank you. That information helps." Ethan simply shook his hand. "I am glad she is in good hands now." The responders escorted the elderly woman outside, reassuring her husband that she appeared stable and would receive further evaluation. As the entrance door closed behind them, a quiet wave of relief spread through the cafe. Customers who had been strangers only minutes earlier exchanged grateful smiles. Claire stepped toward Ethan, her expression no longer filled with curiosity but unmistakable respect. "I knew I had seen that emblem before," she said softly. Ethan smiled politely but remained silent. Claire continued loud enough for those nearby to hear. "It belonged to Charles Bennett, my grandfather." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. Claire nodded. "The man who gave you that medallion was also the person who taught me that leadership begins with character, not status." Every customer in the cafe stared in stunned silence. Derek slowly turned toward Claire, confusion replacing arrogance. She looked directly at Ethan and smiled. With genuine admiration. "My grandfather spoke about only a handful of people with lasting respect. Ethan Carter, you were one of them. I finally understand why." The silence that followed felt completely different from the silence Derek had tried to create earlier. This one was filled not with embarrassment, but with the unmistakable weight of truth. For several heartbeats, no one in Harper's Café moved. Claire Bennett's words seemed to settle over the room with more force than any raised voice ever could. "Ethan Carter, you were one of them." The sentence echoed through the silence, quietly dismantling every assumption that had filled the cafe only minutes earlier. Derek Collins looked from Claire to Ethan as though expecting someone to laugh and admit it had all been a misunderstanding. No one did. Claire stepped closer, her expression carrying genuine warmth rather than corporate authority. "My grandfather rarely spoke about business achievements," she said. "He believed successful companies came and went. Character stayed. Whenever he mentioned someone by name, everyone listened. Yours was one of those names." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. He gave far more to me than I ever gave to him. Claire smiled softly. That sounds exactly like something he would have admired. Around the cafe, customers exchanged embarrassed glances. The young couple near the window quietly remembered hearing Derek mock Ethan's worn jacket. The elderly gentleman folded his newspaper completely and nodded to himself, finally understanding why the father had seemed so familiar. The barista who had struggled to recognize Ethan whispered, "I knew there was something different about him." The manager answered quietly, "We all should have seen it sooner." Emma looked up at her father with innocent pride. "Daddy, was Mr. Bennett your friend?" Ethan smiled gently. "He was someone who taught me lessons I still try to deserve." Claire heard that answer and found herself respecting Ethan even more. Most people would have accepted the praise. Ethan redirected it toward the man who had inspired him. Derek finally broke the silence. "This proves nothing," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried all morning. "Anyone can tell a good story." Claire slowly turned toward him. For the first time, there was unmistakable firmness in her expression. "Stories earn trust when they match a person's actions." She gestured quietly toward Ethan. "Everything he has done today reflects exactly what my grandfather spent his life teaching." Derek shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Claire continued, "You judged him because of his jacket. I recognized him because of his character." Those words settled heavily over the room. Ethan spoke before the silence became uncomfortable again. "Miss Bennett, I appreciate your kindness. But today is not about me." Claire looked at him curiously. Ethan smiled toward the cafe entrance where the emergency vehicle had disappeared only minutes earlier. An elderly woman received the help she needed. "My daughter still gets to finish her Friday breakfast. That is enough reason to be grateful." Emma reached for his hand, smiling brightly. "Can we still finish the muffin?" Ethan laughed softly. "I believe that would be the best decision anyone has made today." Gentle laughter spread across the cafe. For the first time since Derek had entered, the room felt warm again. The tension dissolved naturally, replaced by something far stronger than excitement. It was respect. The waitress approached Ethan carrying a small paper bag. "I packed another chocolate muffin for Emma," she said with a smile. "It is our treat." Emma looked at her father before accepting it. Ethan nodded gratefully. "Thank you. That is very generous." One by one, several customers quietly walked past Ethan's table as they prepared to leave. Some simply smiled. Others offered a handshake. One elderly woman paused long enough to say, "Your daughter is fortunate to have you." Ethan answered every kind word with the same humble gratitude. He never corrected anyone. Never mentioned his past. Never referred to the recognition Claire had given him. Derek watched the growing line of people offering respect that no amount of wealth could purchase. For the first time in years, he understood what it felt like to become invisible. No one mocked him. No one argued with him. They simply stopped paying attention. Claire noticed the expression on Derek's face but returned her attention to Ethan instead. The morning had begun with a father everyone underestimated. It had become something entirely different. Harper's Café was no longer remembering the expensive suit, the loud voice, or the public insults. Everyone would leave remembering the quiet man who had never once needed to prove his worth because he had lived it in every ordinary moment. The quiet conversations gradually returned to Harper's Café, but they sounded different now. The room had not simply witnessed an argument. It had witnessed a lesson. Every person who remained seemed to carry away a different understanding of what respect truly looked like. Ethan Carter gathered Emma's backpack and helped her slip it over her shoulders. "Ready to go?" he asked. Emma smiled as she held the extra muffin the waitress had packed for her. "Can we share it later at the park?" Ethan nodded. "That sounds like a wonderful plan." Claire Bennett stepped forward once more. "Mr. Carter, if you have a few minutes, I would be honored to buy you another cup of coffee." Ethan smiled with genuine appreciation. "Thank you. That is very kind." He glanced down at Emma. "But I promised someone we would spend the rest of the morning together." Emma squeezed his hand proudly. Claire laughed softly. Then I completely understand. She reached into her purse and removed a simple business card before offering it to Ethan. If you are ever willing to have a conversation, I would appreciate the opportunity. Ethan accepted the card politely without looking at it. Thank you. He slipped it into his jacket pocket just as casually as he had carried the old silver medallion. Claire noticed the gesture immediately. There was no excitement. No eagerness. No attempt to impress her. To Ethan, promises to his daughter still came before opportunities that others might spend years pursuing. Somehow, that only increased her admiration. Derek Collins remained standing near the counter, watching the exchange unfold. He had expected Claire to continue speaking with him after everything settled. Instead, she had barely acknowledged his presence since recognizing Ethan. The realization stung far more than he expected. Slowly, Derek walked toward Ethan. Several customers instinctively turned to watch. Ethan met his eyes with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. Derek hesitated before speaking. The words seemed unusually difficult for him. I may have judged you too quickly. Ethan remained silent, giving him time to continue. Derek lowered his eyes briefly. I should not have spoken to you the way I did. The apology was imperfect. It lacked polish. Yet for someone who had spent the morning believing he was always right, it represented a genuine step forward. Ethan smiled kindly. Thank you for saying that. Derek looked surprised. That is all? Ethan nodded. An honest apology deserves an honest acceptance. Derek frowned slightly. You are not angry? Ethan looked toward Emma before answering. If I carried every insult people ever spoke, I would have very little room left for peace. Those words settled over Derek more heavily than any criticism could have. Claire quietly observed the exchange, recognizing that Ethan had done something she rarely witnessed in boardrooms or negotiations. He had allowed another person to recover their dignity without excusing their behavior. That required confidence of an entirely different kind. The cafe manager approached Ethan carrying a small envelope. Sir, he said, everyone here agreed on something. Ethan looked puzzled. What is this? A collection of gift cards from several regular customers. Ethan immediately shook his head. That is generous, but I cannot accept. The manager smiled knowingly. We expected you to say that. He handed the envelope instead to Emma. Then perhaps this is for Friday breakfasts. We would like your tradition to continue. Emma looked toward her father for permission. Ethan paused for a moment before smiling. When kindness is offered with an open heart, it is respectful to receive it with gratitude. Emma accepted the envelope with both hands. Thank you very much. Applause rose gently throughout the cafe, not loud or dramatic, but sincere. Ethan did not stand taller because of it. Claire did not admire him because of his past. The customers did not respect him because of a title. Every meaningful change that had occurred inside Harper's Cafe had come from the same simple truth. Character had quietly accomplished what pride never could. As Ethan and Emma walked toward the front door together, the morning sunlight returned through the windows, filling the cafe with the same warm glow that had welcomed them only a short time before. The difference was that everyone inside now saw the father walking away with completely different eyes. The loudest victory is not the one that echoes through a crowded room. It is the quiet one that changes hearts long after everyone has gone home. Ethan Carter and Emma stepped onto the sidewalk, where the crisp autumn air greeted them with gentle warmth. The noise from Harper's Cafe faded behind them as father and daughter began walking toward the small neighborhood park they visited almost every Friday. Emma slipped her hand into Ethan's, swinging the paper bag that held the extra chocolate muffin. Daddy, she asked after several quiet moments, why did everyone start smiling at you? Ethan looked down with the same gentle expression that had comforted her throughout the morning. Maybe they were not smiling at me. Emma tilted her head. Then who? Ethan smiled. Perhaps they were smiling because they remembered that kindness is still possible. Emma thought about his answer before nodding slowly. I like that better. They continued walking beneath rows of maple trees whose golden leaves drifted softly onto the sidewalk. Behind them, Claire Bennett remained standing just outside the cafe entrance. She watched Ethan and Emma disappear down the street, not with the curiosity of a business executive searching for talent, but with the admiration of someone who had unexpectedly rediscovered a lesson she feared the business world had forgotten. Her phone vibrated with another message reminding her about an executive meeting scheduled within the hour. She glanced at the notification before placing the phone back into her purse without replying. For the first time in months, she realized there was something more important than the next quarterly report. There was culture. There was leadership. There was character. Inside Harper's Café, customers gradually returned to their conversations, but nearly every discussion revolved around the same subject. No one talked about Ethan's old jacket anymore. They talked about his patience. They talked about the way he had comforted his daughter before defending himself. They talked about how naturally he had stepped forward when someone needed help. The cafe manager quietly removed the security camera recording from that morning and saved it. Not because of the argument. Because he wanted to remember what genuine dignity looked like. Derek Collins remained seated alone at the corner table, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. For the first time in many years, silence did not feel like victory. It felt like reflection. He replayed every careless word he had spoken. Every judgment based on appearance. Every opportunity to choose humility that he had ignored. He slowly reached for his phone before stopping. Instead of making another business call, he quietly stood, walked to the counter, and thanked every employee before leaving. It was a small gesture. Perhaps no one else even noticed. But meaningful change often began with ordinary decisions. Later that afternoon, Claire entered the headquarters of Bennett Technologies. Senior executives immediately gathered around her with reports, schedules, and financial projections. Claire listened patiently before asking a single unexpected question. "Tell me," she said, "how many people on our team are being overlooked simply because no one has taken the time to know them?" The conference room became completely silent. It was not a question anyone had prepared to answer. Claire smiled gently, remembering Ethan's quiet confidence. "We are going to start looking more carefully." Miles away, Ethan and Emma sat together on a wooden bench overlooking a peaceful pond. They shared the chocolate muffin while ducks glided across the calm water. Emma leaned against her father's shoulder. "Today was strange," she said. Ethan laughed softly. "Yes. It certainly was. But it ended happy." Ethan looked across the water, watching sunlight shimmer across its surface. "Most good stories do when people choose kindness over pride." Emma smiled. "Can we come back to the cafe next Friday?" Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "Absolutely. Some traditions are worth keeping." As the afternoon sunlight settled over the quiet park, life continued exactly as Ethan preferred it. No headlines followed him. No applause remained. Only the peaceful certainty that true strength had never been about winning an argument. It had always been about protecting another person's hope without losing your own. And somewhere in a small neighborhood cafe, everyone who had witnessed that ordinary Friday morning carried home the same unforgettable lesson: appearances may capture attention for a moment, but character is what people remember for a lifetime.